Hello and welcome to this week's special edition of NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman. I'm Kevin Ochsner. Thanks for joining us. Today we're sitting down with leaders from Dow AgroSciences as well as expert cattlemen to discuss forage management and why it's so important to cattlemen across the country. And joining me in the studio today are Dave Owens, Portfolio Marketing Leader with Dow AgroSciences. Pat Birch is also with Dow AgroSciences and is a field scientist for the organization. Jeff Smink, owner of Center of the Nation Cattle Company in Newell, South Dakota. And Glenn Benjamin, rancher from Sinmla, Colorado, in addition to being president of the Colorado Livestock Association. Gentlemen, thanks so much for coming to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk first of all about what forage management is. And Dave, I want to start with you. Can you just define forage management in your terms?
Sure, absolutely. When I think of it, it follows three pretty simple aspects. The first one is to know as much as you possibly can about your own forage enterprise. And this is probably the hardest thing for most cattlemen to grasp. I mean, they love cattlemen, they love cattle. They know everything there is to know about their particular breed, but a lot of times how to manage that forage is a little bit lacking. And there are literally hundreds of different forage enterprises across the U.S. If you think about down south, you've got folks that are raising Bermuda grass. If you move a little bit west and a little north, you get into fescue areas. And then finally, you get out into the Great Plains and you're into native grass species. You really need to know all the nuances of how that forage responds in order to manage it effectively. The second thing to do is really to set goals for yourself and follow up on them. If you think about that Bermuda grass manager down in the southeast, he might want to raise his cows but also provide some high quality hay for like a neighboring horse farm. If they're doing that, then weed control is going to be critical. You don't want horse nettle making big old black splotches in the middle of your fine coastal Bermuda grass hay. As you move into fescue, you may want to plant some warm season grasses to kind of cover what we call the summer slump in the fescue belt. And then finally, if you get into the native range, you really need to understand what species you have and say, okay, do I want to improve my range condition over a period of time? And if so, what do I need to do from a management perspective to make that happen? And finally, the follow-up is really critical. And I tell folks to be aggressive in monitoring how their forage is responding to the system, grazing system that they have. If you take a look at our good friends down in Texas and Oklahoma last year, their pastures or their rangeland looked an awful lot like my hairline. Okay? They had a little bit of forage around some of the creeks and some of the ponds, some of the wetter areas, but up in the upland areas, absolutely nothing going on. So if their goal was to improve range condition, this drought has really set them back. And they really need to closely monitor how much weed and increased brush pressure they're getting this particular year, and then take action on that to keep themselves moving forward. So those three simple premises are really what I consider when I think about forage management.
The big question in your analogy is, will some spring showers bring back the hairline? That's my question.
Probably not the hairline, but Texas is greening up fairly well, so life is getting better down there.
Jeff, I want to turn to you. What do you see as some of the benefits of good forage management for cattlemen like yourself?
Well, we look at it as an insurance policy. The rest rotation system that we set up years ago was really designed to optimize our grass production. And I think in my area, where it's predominantly western wheatgrass, that the most important part of the grassland ecosystem is not necessarily what you see, but what you don't see. It's the root systems underground. And that resting a pasture for an entire year really allows those root systems to really be healthy and expand, allowing your grasses to be healthier then. And then the other aspect, of course, is the grazing. Our grassland ecosystems evolved under grazing pressures. So to be healthy, they need to be grazed and properly managed. So that's our general philosophy.
Very good. Glenn, you're a cattleman, but you also have a chance to talk to a lot of other cattlemen in your leadership role here in the state of Colorado. What's your perspective?
Well, forage is really the heart of my operation, and it is for many other cattlemen also, because with the increase in grain prices, keeping the cattle out on grass for as long as possible and getting as many pounds as possible is really critical these days. And in my operation, my goal is to graze my cattle year round. So I stockpile a lot of forage for winter grazing and try to keep those cattle out on the grass without having to feed a lot of extra protein or hay. So with the added pressures of yearling operations expanding, trying to get as much gain on grass as possible, this forage production and the amount of grass that you can grow in your pastures is just critical to keep it at a high level.
And tell me this, Pat, from your perspective, is this what you hear as you travel around and visit with other producers all across the country?
Well, most of my experience is in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States, but in our area, I think there's a greater emphasis now on forage management than there has ever been. I think shrinking land bases are driving that, but as well as the grain prices. But there's more interest now in managing that resource to keep those cattle out there longer on the pasture and gain more from it.
Very good. Another thing to take into consideration when it comes to forage management is high corn prices. Forages have always been the foundation of a successful cattle program. Cattleman to Cattleman's Brad Bulla reports that they're becoming even more important as feed costs continue to rise.
For years, feed has been one of the largest single production expenses for cattle operations. But the high cost of grain has many producers rethinking how they do business.
Much of what we do in terms of the overall production system of this industry was driven by the availability of cheap concentrate feeds. And so, as a result, we've become a very grain-intensive industry. There's incentives now for this industry to look at doing things a little bit differently.
For the foreseeable future, there's more value in forage, and most cattle producers realize that a solid forage program is the key to having a profitable operation. The markets reward those who produce forage efficiently and use it to put pounds on marketable cattle. And good forage managers work every day to improve their grazing management and extend the grazing season.
For 40 or 50 years, our question in the industry is basically, how can we get cattle to eat more grain and in the process produce high-quality beef? I think for the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to spend a lot of time focused on the question of how can we produce that high-quality beef using the least amount of grain. I think we'll be trying to utilize more forage and putting emphasis on forage. We'll be looking at utilizing the forages we have more efficiently, more productively, but I think it may also in certain environments suggest that we have some interest in looking perhaps at some new forages or some new forage systems that would be complementary to this new economic environment. I think it's good if producers consciously recognize that there's a different environment. It will present enormous opportunities, particularly for anyone that has forage resources in this country. Those resources have more value now, and there's more flexibility on how to utilize them.
Many of the factors that influence the cattle market change from year to year. However, it looks like feed grain prices will remain inflated for the foreseeable future. This means the increased value of forage and forage management is a new fact of life for the beef industry.
I don't think today we can really envision where we might be able to go. I don't think we're going to go back to the kind of situation where we could afford to not utilize forage effectively. So I suspect for that reason alone that this is a permanent thing.
I'm Brad Bulla reporting for NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman.
You can find more information on the Dow AgriSciences line of range and pasture herbicides at rangeandpasture.com. So Dave, as someone who has a chance to work with producers all across the country, what are you hearing in terms of how these rising costs of corn and feed grains are impacting people's decision about forage management?
I tell you what, it's been very surprising over the last year or so to really watch attitudes about holding on to calves longer change. We took a tour with the American Forage and Grassland Council out in Louisville and went to southern Indiana, which is not necessarily, one of the meccas of cattle production. But the producer's ranch that we went and toured was a beautiful setup. Had lots of rotational grazing, and he had the capability to hold on to those calves for another 100 to 150 pounds of gain. And he said, you know, that's money directly into my pocket. And with today's prices being what they are, I mean, that's very critical to folks. I think we're going to see quite a bit more of intensive forage management and folks really trying to garner some of that additional earnings from their particular herds.
Jeff, from a real-world perspective, again, grass has always been the foundation of your operation. How have these changes in forage prices and the market in general impacted your decision-making?
You know, that's interesting. A good friend of mine has said that when he used to drive around the country, he would look at other people's livestock and their cattle and look at how well they were doing. But now when he drives around the country, he looks at the grass and the grassland and how that looks. And I think in general, the industry is moving that way, where before, they're not minimizing cattle genetics at all, but maybe the grassland production is coming up to the same level as what the cattle production is. So I think that's the direction that our industry is moving.
We're grass farmers first, aren't we?
That's right. That's right.
And Glenn, from your perspective, what have these increased forage and feed grain prices meant in your operation?
Well, actually, they haven't changed a lot of what of my management styles, because we've always relied strictly on a grass. That's kind of our main operation is grass production, turning that into beef. And so we do keep a lot of our calves over for yearlings, and so it's important that we have enough grass available for them to keep them going through until middle of August, 1st of September the following year. But I work a lot with the NRCS, the local conservation districts, to put grazing systems into place, doing a lot of more fencing and those type of things. But also it's important for the cattle, but it's also important for the wildlife. And I think that, you know, with these, anything we can do to improve our grasses and is just good for the whole ecosystem.
Dave, from Dow AgriScience's perspective, I mean, how do you perceive this relative to the long term? Is this a long-term trend, or do you think this is a short-term blip?
Absolutely. No, this is a very long-term blip. Or excuse me, a long-term trend. As we look at it, we're going to see a lot more forage being raised in the east. Much more efficient methodologies. There's some folks that say that we've lost as many as 4 million acres of good pasture land over the last year, mainly to some of the commodity crops like corn and soybeans, CRP coming out of production and going into grain. And so as you look at losing that amount of grass, it's going to be absolutely critical that we produce the rest of those acres and utilize them in a very efficient manner. That's going to mean cross-fencing, that's going to mean weed and brush control is going to become ever more critical. And then as you move out into the western areas, we've had a tremendous encroachment of noxious weeds in this particular area. And it's absolutely critical that to bring those acres back into productivity, not only, as Kevin said, for the cattle, but also for a lot of the wildlife and other multiple uses that we get off of those acres, that we get a handle on those noxious weeds. And so we see that as being a long-term trend as well, to try to get in and really reclaim some of those acres that we've lost.
Yeah, we're going to have to think totally differently about it. Pat, from your perspective, I mean, as you think about how you would recommend producers optimizing the utilization of forage in their operation, what would you recommend?
Well, oftentimes the calls that we get, someone is in a bad situation. They may have a bad weed problem, and that's the reason that we may be contacted. But they really need to look at it more in a holistic manner and trying to integrate this site fertility and grazing management and weed control, so that there's not really a silver bullet there, but there is a holistic approach to managing that land. And so we try to get people away from thinking of just kind of addressing one problem, but understand how they got into that problem.
Very good. Glenn, from your perspective, how does increasing the amount of forage you're able to grow in your operation benefit your operation?
Well, anytime we can grow more grass, we can raise more pounds of beef, which in turn improves our bottom line. So it's really important that we keep our pasture lands in good shape, that we don't let these noxious weeds get out of hand. So we try to monitor that very closely. We spray every spring. We spend a lot of time on four-wheelers running around and spraying weeds. But anytime that we can make our grasses better, it makes our cattle better, and it makes our bank accounts bigger.